Picture a winter night in 1989. A cramped club in London or Berlin, a hand-scrawled flyer on the door, a few dozen earnest faces pressed toward the stage. The bands arriving from Seattle are far from polished export acts. They're rough-edged, experimental, and more interested in volume and honesty than choreography. This introduction sets the scene for why those early European tours mattered. Not as triumphant stadium invasions, but as laboratory missions where the raw ingredients of what would become the Seattle sound were mixed, tested, and refined under pressure. Defining the moment means understanding Seattle as more than geography. It was a tight-knit community of independent labels, DIY venues, and bands like Nirvana and Mudhoney who shared members, ideas, and records. When these groups first crossed the Atlantic, they carried that context with them. Lo-fi recordings, abrasive dynamics, and a punk ethos that rejected mainstream pop production. On European soil, these attributes encountered different audiences, venues, and industry structures, forcing adaptation and catalyzing growth. The significance of those early tours lies in the crucible of touring itself. Long van rides, sparse crowds, and mismatched bills demanded that bands sharpen their songs, tighten pacing, and learn how to communicate energy across cultural divides. For Nirvana, playing nights where only half the crowd showed up pushed them to distill melodies from chaos. For Mudhoney, sharing stages with established punk acts in the UK reinforced a sense of authenticity and stagecraft. These experiences translated back to Seattle as more focused songwriting, bolder performance techniques, and an evolving sound that balanced noise with hooks. Concrete examples illuminate the process. On a 1989 UK tour, Nirvana tested early versions of tracks that would later become anthems, refining tempos and vocal delivery in real time. Mudhoney's encounters with British punk outfits helped them tighten their riff-driven assault and embrace sharper production choices later on. Industry-wise, encounters with independent European labels and zine culture amplified Seattle's network, leading to distribution deals and coverage that seeded wider interest. Not everything was seamless. Language barriers, hostile bookings, and financial strain challenged bands and occasionally hardened attitudes toward mainstream success. Critics argued these shows were too rough to matter, but many musicians and local promoters saw them as formative crucibles. The tours also connected to wider threads: the growth of indie labels, the role of college radio, and the eventual mainstream breakthroughs that would recast those early nights as origin myths. This is the story of refinement on the road, messy, influential, and unmistakably pivotal. Before anyone outside the Pacific Northwest had a name for it, the Seattle sound was a stew of influences, simmering in basements, dive bars, and late-night practice spaces. Define it not as a single genre, but as an attitude, a raw, loud guitar ethos rooted in punk's urgency, metal's volume, and a melodic sensibility that could be both abrasive and oddly catchy. This sound emerged in the early to mid-1980s as young musicians in Seattle absorbed disparate records. The confrontational snarl of punk bands like Black Flag and the Stooges, the heavy riffing of metal acts, the dark, brooding textures of post-punk, then filtered them through local realities: rainy weather, working-class economic stagnation, and a tight-knit scene that rewarded authenticity over polish. The significance of these foundations can't be overstated. Without that local context, Nirvana and Mudhoney would likely have sounded different. The scene provided not only influences, but also rehearsal rooms, mentors, and a circuit of venues that tolerated messy, experimental shows. Seattle's small labels, most notably Sub Pop, functioned as cultural accelerants. They codified aesthetics: the flannel, the lo-fi production, the emphasis on dynamics, and packaged a regional sound that would later be exported overseas. Sub Pop's early singles and compilation albums created a feedback loop. Bands influenced each other, local radio spun the same few records repeatedly, and a sense of shared purpose grew. Concrete examples make this real. First, Green River, whose mix of punk energy and hard rock riffing provided a direct lineage to both Mudhoney and Pearl Jam. Members migrated between projects, carrying ideas forward. Second, Melvins pioneered slow, sludgy tempos and crushing guitar tones that bent metal into something more obtuse, a blueprint for grunge's heavy side. On the melodic end, bands like the Afghan Wigs and indie groups around Seattle introduced a willingness to mix tunefulness with grit, showing that abrasive textures needn't abandon songcraft. Some observers argue that calling it a single Seattle sound simplifies a diverse scene. Different neighborhoods, small labels, and individual artists contributed distinct strands. That critique matters. The scene's variety is why the sound could be refined on the road. As Nirvana and Mudhoney toured Europe, they didn't invent their identity there so much as test and sharpen it, picking up new rhythms, audience responses, and production ideas. The local foundations gave them a vocabulary. The road provided practice and pressure. Together, they transformed a regional collage of influences into a global movement. The first European forays for bands like Nirvana and Mudhoney were less glamour than myth, an exercise in stubborn resourcefulness where booking, shifting lineups, and DIY logistics shaped not just tours but the sound itself. Booking often began with a crumpled flyer, a phone call to a small club, or a correspondence with a European zine. Promoters were usually local punks or record shop owners who wanted to hear what was coming from Seattle. That meant gigs were booked in basements, squats, student bars, and tiny clubs where the stage might be a few planks and the PA barely adequate. For a band whose sonic identity relied on volume and texture, these constraints forced creative adaptation. Guitarists learned to wring character from cheap amps. Drummers tightened their attack to cut through poor sound systems, and vocalists adjusted phrasing to suit rooms with weird acoustics. Lineups were fluid. Nirvana's early European runs often featured temporary members or friends filling in, while Mudhoney's roster occasionally shifted due to visas, money, or burnout. These substitutions mattered musically. A different bassist could push the groove in a new direction, and a stand-in drummer might emphasize tempo over finesse. Such variability turned each show into a rehearsal in public, a laboratory for the Seattle sound, where rawness, dynamics, and melody were tested under pressure. The instability also bred camaraderie. Bands swapped gear, shared transport, and learned each other's songs, creating cross-pollination in riffs, stage moves, and set construction. DIY logistics dominated every decision. Vans were cramped and unreliable, budgets were shoestring, and merchandise sales often paid for the next meal. Bands learned to be self-sufficient, printing their own posters, pressing small runs of singles for sale, and negotiating deals with small labels across borders. This independence preserved artistic control and cultivated scenes that valued authenticity over polished presentation. Yet it posed challenges: financial strain, exhaustion, and legal hurdles like visas and customs frequently disrupted tours and sometimes forced cancellations. These early tours refined the Seattle sound by demanding adaptability. Stripped-down stages and unpredictable conditions emphasized dynamics, soft verses, loud choruses, and a gritty, immediate tone. The experience also connected Seattle bands to European punk and indie networks, seeding future tours and releases. In short, booking mishaps, rotating lineups, and DIY logistics weren't just obstacles. They were crucibles that helped forge the music that later exploded worldwide. When bands like Nirvana and Mudhoney took their raw Seattle music onto the cramped clubs and grimy venues of early European tours, they treated each night as a laboratory. Musical evolution on the road isn't just about playing the same songs for different crowds. It's about how set lists, on-stage experimentation, and constant tweaking of tone and arrangement transformed a regional sound into something tighter, more dynamic, and more immediate. Define what they brought overseas: a blend of punk urgency, heavy distorted guitars, pop hooks buried in feedback, and a vocal delivery that could shift from melodic to snarling in a single line. On tour, those elements were tested against real-time reactions and technical limitations, and evolved accordingly. The significance is twofold. First, live repetition hardened songs into reliable forms, teaching bands which riffs needed tightening and which tempo changes fell flat in a sweaty room. Second, exposure to diverse audiences and opening acts forced creative adaptation. Interaction with European punk scenes and fellow American touring bands provided new ideas for texture and pacing. For example, Nirvana's early European setlists often alternated between short, fast songs and slower, heavier numbers, sculpting contrasts that later became a hallmark of their studio work. Mudhoney, meanwhile, used extended feedback and jam sections to push distortion into rhythmic rolls, a technique refined on the road and evident in later recordings. Concrete examples. On a 1989 UK tour, Nirvana would insert looser covers and impromptu breakdowns into their sets, which led Kurt Cobain to rethink song structures and vocal phrasing, audible in the more deliberate dynamics of songs that followed. Mudhoney's frequent encore experiments with extended fuzzed-out passages in European shows helped them discover optimal amp and pedal settings that translated into the punchier, more controlled fuzz on singles like Touch Me, I'm Sick. Opinions from contemporaries and later critics reinforce this. Musicians who toured together recall late-night sound checks where small changes, mic placement, amp voicings, tempo shifts, yielded big gains. Challenges existed. Unreliable gear, hostile sound systems, and fatigue could obscure nuance, making it hard to know whether a change was artistic progress or just survival. Some purists argue that studio polish dilutes the live menace. Others counter that road-honed precision preserved intensity while improving clarity. Ultimately, touring linked directly to other facets of the Seattle sound: production choices in the studio, image and crowd interaction, and the songwriting economy that valued both melody and mayhem. The road was where rough ideas met pressure, producing a leaner, sharper sound that the world would soon recognize.